Hello. Hello. Welcome to all. Welcome here at Gallaudet. I'm delighted to be here and very excited from the presentations this morning, but I have to say they made me more than a little nervous. And you know, one of the things that's very nerve-wracking about this is that when the nerves hit you, you feel it mostly in your back, right? So you sometimes have to shake it off. That's actually perfect. That tension I'm holding in my back is right in line with my topic because I'm talking about DeafSpace and insights gained from an understanding of DeafSpace and from Dorsality. Now, from the time of Stokey, we started learning about deaf experience and deaf language and the visual nature of our language, and many research findings have come forth from that. But what I propose is that we advance this further to the next level so that we are examining not just the sighted visual experience that we have, but also the dorsal experience, the experience of the world behind us where we cannot see. If you see the image on the screen before you, see birds lined up in a wire, all perfectly equidistant from each other. This image actually has something to do with how we measure, how we innately measure ourselves. So birds on this wire are all lined up about 3 inches from each other. But we, in taking this objective measure from our point of view, are attributing something to the birds that isn't innate to them. Inches are not a measure that's innate to them. They are measuring using their given bodies and given experiences. So I'd like to share two stories from my childhood that come to bear on this. The other picture that you see is the farmhouse that I was raised on and the view from my dinner table. Looking out my window, I could see my father at work all around the farm, and there was a laneway, a driveway, just across a wooded area behind the barn that I couldn't see. There were trees blocking the way, though there was a telephone line that did peak just above the trees. Now, my mom, who is hearing, would from time to time tell me, "Hey, we've got a visitor coming down the road. Go put on a clean shirt." I'd be surprised not knowing the visitor was coming and see them sure enough a few minutes later coming. Well, one day I went and warned my mom, "Hey, Mom, we've got visitors coming." But she couldn't hear any visitor coming. She walked to the window, looked out, and saw, sure enough, a minute later, here came the visitor. She wondered how I knew that they were coming. Well, I did that because I saw the birds lined up on the wire, and the visual cue that I had was all the birds taking flight at once, en masse, from that wire. I knew that was from somebody coming along the road that I couldn't see. Now, at 7 years old, I already knew this. I'd never been given explicit instruction in how to figure this out. Simply from observation, I knew innately how to figure out and infer what was happening. So I had a number of cues, but these cues weren't merely visual. They actually come from a dorsal experience that I have as a deaf person. So dorsality, let's back up for a moment and look at the meaning of the word dorsal. We see it in use in the dorsal fin on a shark. We see it in looking at dorsal muscles, or the dorsal side of anything is the rear of it. And if we look at architecture, we can see the facade is usually ornate on a building, but the dorsal side is usually far less so. So dorsal experiences are given less value and often attributed negative value in our society. But if we take for a moment the imagined rock in our path day to day, we only see one side of it. If we were to lift it and see its dorsal side, we might see a world teeming with life underneath that rock. So the quote that you see here comes from a famous architect and says in sum that there is nothing about people, nothing about humanity that is innately measurable. We, however, come up with means of measure, whether it be a yardstick, a calendar, a string of words set up consecutively. These are all used as means of expressing ourselves. My job in working with DeafSpace Design Research is to look at the decisions that we make in architecture, but back that up so that we are looking at how we quantify space, how we examine and inhabit space. So in one situation, for example, painting of the background of a classroom might be seen as important, but the measure of width on that we paint, that color for contrast with the presenter, is going to vary from a hearing community to a deaf community. A hearing architect would generally think about simply having a decent swath. But a deaf eye is going to look at the perspective of the student and the teacher if it's a classroom. Is this being observed from only 5 feet away from the teacher versus 20 feet away? We would see that space innately different and need the contrast to go much higher because of the visual sight lines that we're attuned to. So a number of these different areas of research have brought these thoughts to mind, but another that strikes me in particular is that of sidewalks. The standard width of sidewalks does not naturally fit that required by deaf people engaging in a signed conversation. Very often, one has to step off and walk off the curb. So I began to collect research data that would help me to understand what would be the perfect formula that we could then apply to create a more appropriate standard width to sidewalks and walking spaces. The research found a wealth of data, and much of that can be found in the Deaf Studies digital journals. One in particular that was striking to me is in this video, and you'll see in this video two participants of a conversational participants walking down a hallway and avoiding an object in their path. I want you to attend to how they do so. So you see this conversational dyad maneuvering around this obstacle with no problem at all. And it's really striking. But this is a story we see often told in the deaf world. We usually say that one conversational participant is responsible for observing the obstacle for the other. And in fact, if you haven't warned me as a conversational participant in the deaf world, I'd be quite upset that you hadn't. But these people navigate this without any explicit cues. What exactly is happening here to function this? We don't see them divert their eye gaze to observe the obstacle and then reroute. Let's take a deeper look at this. After a great deal of study of how humans view the world, how we assess the world, I would agree that we do use peripheral vision. We have a 180-degree field, but we are very selective in how we apply our attention to our visual field. Basically, it's widely agreed upon that deaf people do not in fact see with greater acuity, nor do we see a wider span of peripheral vision. However, we attend to that visual space and peripheral field differently than do hearing people. We see differently, not better. But one thing that I struggle with, though, is looking at how we select what we attend to in a different way than others do. So hearing conversational participants, for example, can hear from a 360-degree field around them. They're getting information about the world that is overlaid on their 180-degree visual field from this auditory channel. So anything that's happening in their dorsal experience can be inferred from the auditory cues that they get. In these research findings, we then wanted to look at deaf people. So yes, deaf people are visual people. Okay, but that doesn't explain what causes these adaptations visually. So we generally accept that they are deaf and that is innately what's happening, nothing else. We give no attention to the dorsal experience. It's not counted, measured, or quantified. So this really begs us to explain in greater detail how at 6 years old I inferred the meaning given from the flight of the crows. How did I do this without explicit instruction? And what about my dorsal experience gives this notion to me? So in DeafSpace, we're looking at a number of different factors to help us in design, but I found a few that I can share with you today in brief. In DeafSpace, we look at how deaf people occupy a space such as a restaurant or a classroom. In a restaurant, if I'm the first to get there, I'm most likely to sit with my back to the wall so that I have control of what enters into my visual field. So I would certainly not sit in the middle of the space with my back to the bulk of the restaurant. I would reduce these stressors by controlling my dorsal experience. So if somebody else, though, is there, I would be willing to sit in a different space. So the picture that you see on the screen shows a forward-looking picture that depicts a shadow of an object that's behind us. So we are using cues from our dorsal experience to infer what's happening. So this picture clearly shows that there is a street light just behind me, though the street light itself is not in my visual field. And so when we encounter each other, when two of us are in a dyad, we then have an effect on our dorsal experience because the conversational partner is imbued with a sense of trust by his partner to notify each other of experiences in their dorsal field. In this film, You see people walking backwards, and the camera view is unusual because in looking at the deaf experience in the deaf community, if people want to experience what it's like to be deaf, they very often will plug their ears. Well, the absence of sound doesn't give you that experience of being deaf. I say leave that behind. This kind of video experience that you saw, walking backwards and navigating a space, is much better. Because when you're walking forward, your eyes can take advantage or use the sensory reach to see the columns, to see whatever, and know that you are walking straight. This is also true when you're walking backwards. You use the surrounding environment to infer your dorsal world. This is an embedded experience throughout deaf lives. What I would propose to you then is that examining our visual experience is wonderful, it's great, but that is also mapped onto what gives us meaning in terms of the space behind us and our dorsal experience. We usually stop at looking at the person being deaf as though that explains everything, but what role then does dorsality give us in understanding a deaf person's epistemological interpretation of the world around them, and how is that embedded in our research framework, with our experimental methodologies, with the ways in which we are examining deaf people in their dorsality? I've talked about how we manage our dorsal experience when we're alone, but if we look at a dyad of deaf people, when they look at each other, the intersection of their eye gaze extends this sensory reach. We are then now able to extend sensory reach for the other conversational partner's dorsal experience, and I am now responsible for my partner's dorsal world and informing them of any cues to significant changes in that. And they, in turn, are doing the same for me throughout that dyadic interchange. In this next video, you see Dr. Ben Mahan in his Deaf Studies Digital Journal has looked at Italian experiences in Italy and out in public, looking at some underlying similarities in their use of conversational eye gaze. And you would see in this Italian pair of deaf people the same kinds of cues and warnings for the dorsal experience and something coming along in their field. For example, a car that they might run into briefly. Without turning and explicitly looking at the car, very slight visual information was taken, shared with the person to extend their sensory reach to their own dorsal field. So this aspect of dorsality asks us to look at further tools we can use to understand the visual experience. We have eye tracking software, we have GoPro cameras, but how do we then begin to measure and quantify the dorsal experience? So I did so by looking at different conversational dyads, some hearing and some deaf, where GoPro had mounted cameras, and asked them to walk along H Street in one direction, crossing the medians, etc., and converse while doing so. So I looked at the hearing dyad, who engaged in spoken language with each other, and then what I did was then analyze the videotapes for moments when their visual field extended both parallel forward, non-intersecting, and compared that with how often their visual fields did intersect with each other's. So you see the two dyads there representing the data feed. The green lines show points of intersection where their visual field intersected and degree of intersection. The results from the tallying, I'm not prepared to show you all of the data right now, but in some, the deaf conversational dyads had much greater intersection and for greater duration of intersection of visual field than did anybody else. A whole host of questions is begged from this finding. One of those is that of expression. Again, as we are navigating a space and using expression, I am in some ways giving minute expressions that you then interpret to get cues about your dorsal experience. And we do this for each other in turn, serially, as we walk along and engage in a conversation. The video that you saw here, the green there indicates where eye gaze of both was consistent and looking directly at each other. And then you can also see an indication in the data on your screen showing when intersection happened consecutively but not simultaneously. And then you can also see some of the data in the hearing pair where they intersected very little. So if all the conversation was only consecutively intersecting, then the data should show that. But what we saw was that for more than half of the entire conversational space, when two deaf people were engaged in a conversation, they were not, the one actively signing was not looking away from his conversational pair and still conversing. They in fact were looking at each other. So this shows that I do in fact have to engage in some kind of intersection of eye gaze with my partner, and some of that is because of the dorsality of our experience. I am engaging and intersecting eye gaze with them so that they can then warn me of whatever's happening in my dorsal experience. And honestly, if they failed to give me those warnings, I would tell them, you know what, you just walk on ahead. We'll have our conversation when we get there, because it's a really hard and fast requirement of a conversational pair using sign language. And so this experience of dorsality begs for more research, and there's a great deal of potential with it. For example, if we look at how deaf children are taught and educated, we have looked at cognition, we've looked at language, we looked at many of these things, but we have to perhaps look at how we've interpreted that historically. But the fact is that there are a great many more cues that we have for human experience and human being than have been told. With that, I want to thank all of you for watching me and watching my back throughout this whole presentation. Thank you very much.